In the last lesson, I asserted that it has been conjectured by human observers that God is not fair. I stated that the fairness as a descriptor of God is inappropriate and nonsensical because God is divine. It is more appropriate to assert that God is just and by God's own sovereign choice shows mercy. I also asserted, as it relates to God's mercy, the sovereignty of God is one of the greatest intellectual obstacles to belief in God's power and might. In Romans 9:15, God says to Moses, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. So, God's self-disclosure of divine autonomy or sovereignty with the corroborating corollary, God's mercy, does not depend on human will or effort. It is the measure. Now, this is how we measure God's righteousness. Now, in this lesson, I will examine the most powerful attack on the sovereignty of God. Now, this is the enemy's most powerful attack, and it is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a direct attack on the existence of God. Now, we know Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it's impossible to please God, but anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. So that's a direct attack on that. Specifically, if evil exists, then God does not exist. That's the bottom line of the problem of evil. The background, I want to give some background and history of this notion. And it starts with a guy, or with a person named Epicurus. And he was a Greek philosopher born in 374 BC. Now, he is an ancestor, one of the ancestors of unaffiliated free thinking. And he is credited with having or with producing the origin of the problem of evil, with what is called his Epicurean paradox, or riddle of Epicurus, or the Epicurus trilemma. All right? Unaffiliated, now let me finish this definition, means atheist, agnostic, or no religion. And I'm including all unbelievers under unaffiliated. Now, what Epicurus says, he says, God, he says, either wishes or takes away evil and is unable, or he is able and is unwilling, or he is neither willing nor able, or he is both willing and able. If he is willing and is unable, he is feeble, which is not in accordance with the character of God. If he is able and unwilling, he is envious, which is equally at variance with God. If he is neither willing nor able, he is both envious and feeble, and therefore not God. If he is both willing and able, which alone is suitable to God, from what source then are evils? Or why does he not remove them? Okay, now that's the origin of the problem. David Hume, in 1779, something like 20 centuries later, summarized the Epicurean paradox. And he says, is he willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing, then he is malevolent. is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Now, Hume asserted that the paradox, still in his time frame anyway, was yet unanswered. So going back to Epicurus, and to give a little bit more background on him, he asserted that philosophy's purpose is the attainment of happy and tranquil lives characterized by peace and freedom from fear and the absence of pain. He also asserted that one could attain this goal by living a self-sufficient life surrounded by friends. He taught that the root of all human neurosis is denial and the tendency for humans to assume that death will be horrific and painful, which he claimed causes unnecessary anxiety, selfish, self-protective behaviors, and hypocrisy. According to Epicurus, death is the end of both the body and the soul, and therefore should not be feared. That although the gods exist, they are not involved in human affairs, and that people should act ethically, not because the gods punish or reward them for their actions, but because due to the power of guilt. Now again, I don't know why a person would feel guilty in this system, but what he said was amoral behavior would be the result that would inevitably lead to remorse weighing on their consciences, and as a result, they would be prevented from attaining peace and freedom from fear. Epicureanism reached the height of its popularity during the late years of the Roman Republic. It died out in late antiquity due to Christian opposition. Now, his teachings rebounded gradually in the 15th century with the rediscovery of his writings, but his ideas did not become acceptable until the 17th century, when a French Catholic priest revived a modified version of them. His thinking grew considerably during and after the Enlightenment, impacting the ideas of major unaffiliated thinkers. Epicurus was an empiricist, meaning he believed that only the senses are a reliable source of knowledge about the world. Now, I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Epicurus was also a hedonist, meaning that he taught that what is pleasurable is morally good and what is painful is morally evil. He defined pleasure as the absence of suffering and taught that humans should seek to attain the state of untroubledness, a state in which a person is completely free from pain or suffering, which is an interesting position considering that he died a painful death. He argued that most of the suffering which humans experience is caused by the irrational fears of death, divine retribution, and punishment in the afterlife. Epicurus, I'm still with him, asserted that people seek wealth and power on account of these fears, believing that having more money, prestige, or political power will save them from death. He maintained that death is the end of existence and that terrifying stories of punishment in the afterlife are ridiculous superstitions, and that death is therefore nothing to be feared. Now, here's a quote from him, from Epicurus. Accustom thyself to believe that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply sentience, and death is the privation of all sentience. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils. Now, I don't know how you thought it was awful, if you're not going to fear it, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. From this doctrine arose what was called the Epicurean epitaph, and it went like, I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care, which is inscribed on the gravestones of his followers and seen on many ancient gravestones of the Roman Empire. This quotation is often used even today at humanist funerals. So now let me get back to what he originated, the problem of evil. The problem of evil has two facets: the intellectual problem and the emotional problem. The intellectual problem is questioning the coexistence of God and evil. The emotional problem is comforting those who suffer by mitigating the emotional dislike for God who would permit such evil. The intellectual problem is addressed by a philosopher or theologian. The emotional problem is addressed by a pastoral or spiritual care provider. So, it is important to keep this distinction clear, because the solutions to the intellectual problem may appear inconsiderate, indifferent, and insensitive to one who suffers, whereas solutions to the emotional problem may appear anecdotal, speculative, and mythical to one researching academically. Okay? Let's go back. The intellectual problem of evil is an eternal or external problem. Now, we're going to break this down. The internal version attempts to show the impossibility of the coexistence of God and evil. Now, in the internal version, there is no possible world in which God and evil coexist. The two are logically incompatible. So the notion is, if one exists, the other does not. Either God exists or evil exists. So, since evil exists as an undeniable reality, then logically God must not exist. That's the if-then. Scripture in both testaments refute this assertion. Job 1:6-8 says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Revelation 12:10b says, for the accuser of our brethren, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. Now, these scriptures, the scriptures I just quoted, alone disprove the notion if evil exists, then God does not exist. God is obviously having a conversation with the enemy, with Satan. And Satan is standing before God. Therefore, God exists, as does evil. And if you look at the context, God is preeminent by both of those scriptures. So that disproves it right there biblically. The external or evidential problematic version attempts to show that that given the amount of evil in the world, it is improbable that God exists. The probabilistic version of the problem of evil admits that it is possible now that God and evil coexist, but insists that it's highly improbable because of all the evil and suffering and pain that exists. The book of Habakkuk refutes the intensity of evil argument. That book is a dialogue between the prophet and God. Habakkuk complains to God and expresses his perplexity that wickedness, strife, and oppression are rampant in Judah. And God seemingly is doing nothing about it. However, when God talks back to him, when God responds to him and tells him what he is preparing to do through the ruthless Babylonians, Habakkuk's perplexity only intensifies. He asks God, how could God, who is too pure to look on evil, appoint a heathen nation to execute judgment on his people? God, now think about this. God had already forcibly removed Israel, and now he was going to forcibly remove Judah for a season anyway. So that just tells you right there. And when I say forcibly remove, they were going to come in and rip them out of the land and kill people and do some serious damage to Judah. So, from a biblical perspective, this right there by itself refutes both of those arguments. However, what I'm going to do, now that's the biblical perspective. I want to offer an apologetic and theological perspective and come at it from the rational. Some people don't like the biblical. The rational. The unaffiliated asserts two premises. One, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he can create any world that he desires. And two, if God is omnibenevolent, then God prefers a world without evil over a world with evil. The unaffiliated reasons that an omnipotent God could create a world containing free creatures who always freely choose to do the right thing. Did you catch that? Such a world would be sinless, free of all moral evil, a world in which no natural evil occurs, free from pain and suffering. They get that. They contend that such a world must be possible. Now they're getting ready to attack the Christian truth claim. Because if it were not, that would imply that sin is necessary and that the future so-called new heaven and new earth, where there is no sin or suffering, is a myth. So if God is preparing a place for the saved after this life, why didn't God do it in the first place? That's pretty straightforward right there. So here's my response. If one has free will, and there's the kicker right there, free will, then the incompatibility assumption of the coexistence of God and evil are not necessarily true. Now, I've already talked about that biblically, but let me talk about it theologically. Even though God did not create a sinless world, that does not necessarily negate God's existence. The fact that God is preparing a world free of sin and suffering means it can be done. Think about it. That's a definite Christian truth claim that even the unaffiliated know about. But why God did not make this world free of sin and suffering is again because of free will. I'm back to it. God being omnipotent does not imply logical impossibilities can be done. like making a round square or overriding free will. If God causes a person to make a specific choice, then the choice is no longer free. Now, think about it. It is God himself who granted intelligent creatures free will in the first place. God will not force his choice on anyone, even though God knows the end from the beginning. God established the circumstances and the context in which a person has a free choice to make. Now, again, we got to lay things square at the feet of where they fit. God set up this whole thing. Let me talk about that a little bit. After Lucifer failed in his insurrection attempt in heaven, he was cast down to earth. God made Adam and Eve and put them right where he cast the enemy down. Now, you could ask, anybody could ask, why did God allow Lucifer, I'm talking about Satan, in the garden in the first place? Why didn't he cast Lucifer into a whole nother solar system, another galaxy somewhere? Why did he put him here and then put us here too, as well? Here's another one. Why did God put the tree of knowledge in the garden, knowing what was going to happen, or what was going to happen? And when the whole conversation between Lucifer and Eve was going on, why didn't God intervene? Think about this. Adam and Eve were innocent, without a sinful nature, and chose from no sinful nature to disobey God. That was actually more difficult for Satan than it is with us. He had to convince people without a sinful nature to choose to disobey God. He had to do that himself. Now his Adam and Eve's descendants, are guilty with a sinful nature and must choose to obey or disobey God. Think about this. So, apparently, now this is I'm gonna call this a Kirkism, or theology just and philosophy jumps out. Apparently, the process of making a sinless world of free creatures is a two-step process that involves having a world, the one we're in right now, where free creatures have his or her lifetime to choose whether to believe God or not. This is our lifetime. We can believe the gospel or not. We can believe God or not. We can choose or not. Once the choice is made, God seals the person to his or her choice. Hebrews 9:27 says, just as a man and woman are destined to die once, and after that face judgment. So what is being judged? What's being judged, I said that way, is the person's choice in this life, whether to believe God or not. That's what's really being judged. We can talk about all the other stuff, the works and everything else, but at the end of the day, it's our choice. Revelation 20:12-15 says, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open, and another book was open, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books, and the sea gave up the dead that was in it. And death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Now, I know that Epicurus asserted that this was superstition. However, my question is, since he was an empiricist, how did he know? How did he independently verify that the biblical account is untrue? Or is it a superstition? How did he come to that conclusion? Returning to the, why should I believe him or anybody else for that matter? Returning to the argument now, God sovereignly uses the world system with its evil, sin, and suffering as what I'm calling a divine sorting machine. He is sorting out the wheat from the weeds, the sheep from the goats, those who are and are not. God is using this world system as a divine sorting machine. So with respect to this world, the first assertion is invalid. Right there, theologically and philosophically and rationally. But what about the second assumption? That if God is omnibenevolent, that God prefers a world without evil over a world with evil. Now that sounds right, doesn't it? Again, let me just think about this now. Regarding this world, such an assumption is not necessarily true, especially if God is using this world as a divine sorting machine. Then all of us must allow that God has sufficient reason for allowing pain and suffering. God may permit suffering in our lives to build or test us, or to build or test others, or to achieve some other overriding end. So, the assumption that God prefers a world with no evil over a world with evil is also not necessarily true, depending on what he's using as his means to arrive at his goal. Therefore, both arguments are invalid. And the logical problem or the intellectual problem of evil, then, I'll say it that way, has been resolved. Isaiah 55 verse 8 says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways." The internal or evidential, probabilistic, and external problem of evil are similar, but a little bit more complicated. Even though the existence of God is possible, the world seems filled with so much pointless evil and unnecessary suffering that the existence of God seems improbable, as well as any sort of sufficient reason for all of this pain and suffering. Now I say again, this is a little bit or much more complicated argument than the internal logical problem of evil. The conclusions for this are a little bit more modest and much easier to prove. Now here's my response to this probabilistic, evidential side. God exists, period. If the internal logical problem of evil were a sound argument, then God would not exist. Again, period. Probabilities are relative. They're hypotheticals relative to one's worldview. This is how you see it, and that's all that matters. But just because you have a certain worldview and maybe you are very much into it, does not make it right. Now, you can say the same thing about me, but let me keep going about me. Thus, with a probability argument, which is what most people have, one must ask, probable with respect to what? In this case, the amount of evil, sin, and suffering in the world, the fact that maybe Christians act bad and are not doing right or hurt your feelings or what? Is that the probability argument you're making? That believers aren't perfect? That you got hypocrisy in the church? Is that the probable Is that what we're respecting here? Is that the probability we're talking about? We don't act devout enough or something? This is, you got to fit all this in here. But now, here's the situation for Christianity as compared to any other religion out there or any other belief system, regardless of whatever you want to call it. Christianity stands or falls on the historicity of the gospel of Christ. If the gospel is false, if it's wrong, if it's false, if Jesus did not rise from the grave, if the gospel is false, then Christianity collapses. Again, period. There is no middle ground. There is no part way. It's either true or false. All right? I offered a notion as to why God permits and uses evil. But let me be honest. Let me be absolutely honest. Positionally, no one in humanity has a perspective or context to assess it. 1 Corinthians 12, 4-6 says, "Now there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are a variety of service, but the same Lord. And there are a variety of activities or operations, depending on your version, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone." Jesus said in another passage, God is always working. Think about this. Until this day. Now, I'm going to just say it point blank. The fact is that only an omniscient mind could grasp the complexities of directing a world of free creatures toward a divine intention. All you have to do is think about the innumerable, incalculable contingencies involved in arriving at a single historical event in relation to every other event in nature. Think about this. A victory versus a defeat. All of the birth versus a non-birth. Every historical event. Can you imagine what it would take to orchestrate that? And not only that, the entire ecosystem of this world encompassing with the universe working together, keeping all the planets in place. All of this going on simultaneously. Now, we can think about ourselves because we're limited to space and time. But when you think about what it takes to control an entire universe and everything in it, you'd have to have an omniscient mind. And we don't have that. Certainly, I'll say this, many evils seem pointless and unnecessary. But we have no idea of the complexities involved for God to arrange the circumstances and free agents in them requisite to divine purposes. However, here I'm back to where I started. The historicity of the gospel of Jesus Christ establishes the existence of God regardless. Nail that down. No other. Every other belief system is either a philosophy, a bunch of axioms, a bunch of thoughts, something somebody put together, a smorgasbord of good sounding words. But where is the independent thing that makes it right? The gospel stands independent of all philosophies, thoughts, and feelings and all of that. Facts are true regardless. You might want to accept it, but that's a fact. So we are stopping here. We have examined the internal and external aspects of the intellectual problem of evil as a direct attack on God's existence. Grace and mercy are grounded in God's power, faithfulness, and sovereign choice alone. In the next lesson, we will continue our examination of the emotional problem of evil. May God bless and keep you. Amen, amen, and amen.